So we're going to begin. Today's topic is the rise of English in accordance with Terry Eagleton's take on it in his Introduction to Literary Theory. And as was the last time, I'm going to take issue with his framing of the topic, which is probably not surprising to you. I said that I was going to do that from the outset. And the reason I want to do that is because I think that when he's talking about literary theory, he is going to talk about it in the context of English literature, which is fair because he's English. He's writing in England for an English audience, and so there's something of the context of the rise of English as a field of study in English universities is part of the discussion. So it's entirely fair in what he says on this front. Some of it will be entirely accurate and some of it appropriate. And basically, you can't disagree with what he's saying on a certain level. On the other hand, literary theory as a discipline, or literary criticism, is an ancient discipline. And it long predates the study of English in the university level, at the highest, at the academic level, as it were. We have seen last semester that poetics goes back at least as far as Plato and Aristotle. And classical poetics is established by Aristotle, and the neo-Hellenistic critics expand to some degree on that and bequeath to us a certain vocabulary and concepts which are passed on into the discipline even of English literature. And so we can't do what Eagleton, it appears to me, has done, which is talk about the rise of English as a phenomenon that only dates back to the 18th century. It seems to me to be too short a time frame to consider the topics under discussion, especially if we're talking about literary criticism, which is the principles, if there are any, the universal principles of studying literature and what it means and the purpose of that study, etc. So you have to bring the frame broader than that. And we did that last semester when we looked at historical literary theories. I think that's what we called the course was called. And I need to say that because that was my immediate, going back and reading Eagleton on this, my immediate response is that Eagleton is already creating an outcome caused by his preconceptions. And a methodology will arise out of that. But it's because of his biases and the way in which he's decided to limit his discussion, we're going to have a certain outcome. And the certain outcome is in accordance with his Marxism, which is that the rise of English is a matter of class struggle. And there were aristocratic assumptions about English in the Augustans, the 18th century critics, neoclassical poetics, if you want, in English, Pope, Swift, Johnson. And that's the beginning of the whole study of English and the rise of English, with the rise of the novel as well. Remember, the novel is a new literary form, as the name suggests. And the rise of English is accompanied by a rise in prosperity amongst the English middle classes. And although in the schools, they still study Greek and Latin as the models of good literature. They also read English on the side, and we see that if we just use Jane Austen as an illustration here, women read novels, although there's some sense of that by reading novels, they're not really reading the substantive things. They ought to be reading in Greek and Latin. And we can see that holds true amongst women, even in the aristocracy. So, for example, Queen Elizabeth is fluent in Greek and Latin, can read in those. And that would be the expectation of anyone who is educated, male or female, in the Renaissance period. Kings and queens would be conversant with the original texts in those languages. And a place like Oxford University, where Lewis and Tolkien went, it was the precondition for entry, is facility with those languages. And you would study greats. That's what they would call them, the greats. Just greats, actually. both men, we'll take Lewis and Tolkien as examples here, who became famous professors of English literature, are not studying English literature when they go to the university. They're studying Greek and Latin. And Tolkien branches out into northern languages only when he realizes that he has a greater taste for those, and he's not doing quite as well in the greats as he would like to. So he branches into, among other things, Anglo-Saxon and Norse literature, etc. And he acquires the language competence in those areas and he has the tool set from the Greco-Roman tradition to look at those other languages in accordance with the skill set that he has acquired previous to this. And then he teaches only English literature in English to English people. So these are men who are trained in the classical languages with a classical mindset, and then they come to their studies. And of course, their studies, however, are in eras of literature that, quite frankly, Mr. Eagleton is not interested in. He's not interested in Old English or Middle English, for that matter. He's not interested in Anglo-Saxon. He just excludes it from consideration. He only takes interest in the Renaissance and onward. And the Renaissance is an interesting period because it's the revival of an ancient approach. We know that the word Renaissance means rebirth, right? And whether it's in French or English or in Italian or whatever, there's a sense of rebirth, and the rebirth is that of classical learning. So I want to say a little bit about that, and also want to go back to our friend Longinus, whom we mentioned last semester in his treatise on the sublime, Parahypsos. I think I have a better one than that. In transliterated Greek, hypsos. Longinus. I mentioned to you that this treatise appears only in the Renaissance. It's lost, and it seems to have no particular influence in the medieval period. But it becomes increasingly important in the 17th century, and even more so in the 18th century. And why is that? Because in Longinus's lexicon, works of men like Homer and Archilochus and Pindar and Sophocles are put alongside figures like Plato and Demosthenes, and even Scripture. These figures are put alongside one another, and Plato and Demosthenes are orators, or in the case of Plato, a philosopher. So what on earth is Longinus doing, putting people who are clearly poets alongside those who are clearly not poets? He's recalibrating the discussion of what constitutes the subject matter of literature, is what I'm going to submit to you. And he does it in accordance with what he calls greatness of spirit. Remember, we talked about that. It's one of the 5 things. There is, but this one is greatness of spirit, and this becomes ever more important in the 18th century, such that it becomes the dominant consideration in Romantic poetics and thereafter. Now, look at this. Greatness of spirit will include a new definition of a classic. It's a new definition. Like last time we looked at T.S. Eliot's discussion of tradition and the individual talent, and I also looked at the issue of the canon, which is associated with the classic in some ways. But now there's a redefinition, and the redefinition, note for yourselves, and it's pretty obvious, now excludes considerations of genre or poetic structure or the rules of genre. Those are not part of the discussion in Longinus. Rather, it's the expression of a great spirit. And if it's the expression of a great spirit, then we can go in the direction of Percy Bysshe Shelley and include Jesus and the poetry of the Bible as an expression of greatness of spirit. And we can throw Plato in that, and we can throw in Lycurgus, we can throw in all manner, and Solon, the lawgiver of Athens. They have great spirit that continues to demonstrate or exhibit its greatness to those that follow. And so there's a redefinition of what constitutes a classic in the 18th century away from genre. And that 18th century is the period in which Eagleton begins the discussion of English literature. He sort of mockingly suggests that in the Renaissance there's all sorts of things that seem not to fit the idea of poetry. As a proof, as a way of demonstrating that literature really is whatever we want it to be called. And especially imaginative literature. Remember, he is going after that and he's ridiculing it, but he's beginning in the 18th century, and what comes before it he basically can't understand and ridicules, and use it as a pretext to say, well, actually we can include all manners of writing under what we call literature because look, the Renaissance did. And therefore we can call Mills and Boon or Peanuts or some sort of comic strip works literature, or even great literature, just as we would call Shakespeare. In fact, there may be a time it's possible to consider the possibility that one day Shakespeare will no longer even be considered as literature. And so where does the change from one period to the next come from? According to Eagleton, it's just simply related to power and who controls the levers of power. So here he says in his introduction, in 18th century England, the concept of literature was not confined, as it sometimes is today, to creative or imaginative writing, which again we saw he attributed to the Romantics, rightly so. In the 18th century, it meant the whole body of valued writing in society: philosophy, history, essays, and letters, as well as poems. Yes, because again, Longinus was the dominant figure and cited regularly, and it was greatness of spirit that was the prime consideration in what we meant by literature or valued writing. So what made a text literary, Eagleton goes on, was not whether it was fictional. The 18th century was in grave doubt about whether the new upstart form of the novel was literature at all, but whether it conformed to certain standards of polite letters. I can come back to that in a second. The criteria, he's got polite letters in scare quotes, the criteria of what counted as literature, in other words, were frankly ideological. Now that is an unnecessary conclusion. Might even be unwarranted, but it's certainly his conclusion that it was ideological, I think bears scrutiny at any rate. Whereas a street ballad, a popular romance, and perhaps even the drama did not. At this historical point, then, the value-ladenness of the concept of literature was reasonably self-evident. In the 18th century, however, literature did more than embody certain social values. It was a vital instrument for their deeper entrenchment and wider dissemination. 18th century England had emerged battered but intact from a bloody civil war in the previous century, which had set the social classes at each other's throats, and in the drive to reconsolidate a shaken social order, the neoclassical notions of reason, nature, order, and propriety, epitomized in art, were key concepts. With the need to incorporate the increasingly powerful but spiritually rather raw middle classes into unity with the ruling aristocracy to diffuse polite social manners, habits of correct taste, and common cultural standards, literature gained a new importance. It included a whole set of ideological institutions: periodicals, coffee houses, social and aesthetic treatises, sermons, classical translations, guides to manners and morals. Literature was not a matter of, quote, felt experience, personal response, or imaginative uniqueness. Such terms, indissociable for us today from the whole field of the literary, would not have counted for much with Henry Fielding, the novelist of the period. Okay, so I read that at some length there. He is correct in one sense. We can certainly see that literature has now included the middle classes in a way that it had not been. That's certainly the case in the 18th century. And we can note also things like all the things that he attributes to the Enlightenment are certainly values of the Enlightenment. So he talks about it being value-laden. Yes, the values of the Enlightenment in things like the notion of reason, of nature, of order, of propriety, etc. in art. Yes, and we can also note things, the rise of etiquette manuals in the 18th century. How to speak in certain situations so as to be polite and not to cause offense. Those are there, and they're there to school the middle classes in how to speak in company with the aristocrats. So we get a notion of politeness that arises, a certain type of speech. And that does not go away because we also have today a certain notion of political correctness, which is exactly the same phenomenon. It's an etiquette manual, political correctness. But now it's not in order to be excellent, be like an aristocrat, it's to be included in civil society at all. It's a downward pressure rather than an upward pressure. But in both cases, note that we have this word, the polis, here in polite letters. They're called polite letters in the 18th century. And political correctness has the same concept of the polis. And in both cases, I think it pushes the discussion of what poetry is for in a broader direction than simply of personal delight, like Harold Bloom had done. Aesthetic, it's just taste. It's something that I do for myself and only for myself. It has no connection with morality. In fact, it excludes morality as a consideration, says Harold Bloom. As I said, it's a very odd position that he takes, particularly as a defense of the tradition, and it comes at the end of the tradition, really, and he admits that the battle's over. And he admits it as much as anything by being the defender who has such a weak defense that it immediately collapses, and he has to bequeath his books to a Catholic liberal arts college because only they're going to bother even reading the texts that he thinks are worth reading. The rest of the academy is going to go down the direction of identity group studies, cultural studies, and abandon the study of literature altogether. We'll get back to that at any rate. But note here that Eagleton frames it in the 18th century and does not consider what happens in the 18th century outside of that in a broader critical sense, but Longinus is the point here. Longinus becomes important because he can attribute greatness of spirit to nature and to reason, right? Longinus's terms are amenable to those things. Even in Robert Louth's, the professor of Old Testament, I think, at Oxford University, he writes on the sacred poetry of the Hebrews. Can't remember the date exactly, 1740 something. In Latin, on the sacred poetry of the Hebrews, Oxford professor, he attributes the long-standing greatness of the Old Testament as poetry to the fact that it doesn't follow the rules of poetry, but that it expresses a greatness of spirit and a natural a natural greatness of spirit, which he says means that it can be translated from one language to the next and retain its vigor. It's because it doesn't follow the neoclassical rules. It doesn't follow the stipulates of genre or neoclassical notions like meter and rhyme from Greek and Latin, that it translates into almost any language. So if you read the Old Testament, poetry like the Psalms in English or French or German or Spanish or you name it, it has a vigor to that. And what does he attribute it to? He attributes it to greatness of spirit and its proximity to nature. So nature becomes the hall note of the 18th century. And I would say poetics goes down that path, and the study of literature furthermore does. So it is now more strongly associated with human nature, a universal human nature, in keeping with the Enlightenment. Does that make sense? So that's the context, and Eagleton ignores all of that. It's not that what he says is wrong, it's that he ignores the broader study of literature as a phenomena and really is only interested in it from the 18th century onward. And literary criticism, likewise, is so. And then, if it's about greatness of spirit, and there are no female authors in that, or there are no queer authors in that, or there are no black authors in that, or there are no Hispanic authors in that in studying English, what are we saying about those people? Because this is a comment. Spirit is a human feature, not so much textual. It's a feature of the mind that created it. Are we saying something about the people who create this? And Eagleton says, yes, we are. And so the people who have great spirits are the aristocrats, and they happen to be, to use contemporary parlance, dead white European males. Right? As soon as this pivot happens, now it's not intentional in the 18th century, but that's the effect of this, is that the study of literature becomes effectively the study of other people's spirits. And then the methodology that arises in the 19th century, which I've repeatedly talked about, the Geisteswissenschaften, the spiritual sciences, comes to the fore, and it will study the greatness of spirit, rather than take the old traditional path of what the humanities does. And if you want to study in this, and you have the time, go to Cicero's work, De Officiis, the offices, and he talks about the humanitas function of literature. It humanizes us. That's the purpose of studying poetry even. It humanizes us. It makes us more of what we are and less of what we could be. And this is a discussion that goes all the way back to the debate between Plato and the philosophers. Who ought to be the teacher of all Hellas? Ought it to be Homer, the poets, or ought it to be the philosophers? And we know where Plato comes down on that, at least in the Republic. It's so strong that he excludes the poets from the polis altogether. They've got to go. We'll let the philosophers, because the philosophers deal with the true, the beautiful, the just, the good, etc. And the poets, quite frankly, mix lies with falsehood, with truth. They talk about the gods, but the gods behave abominably. And so they can't be. They're appealing to our passions, our affections. They move us with beauty, but they don't do it alongside truth. And truth has to be the dominant form of considering the topic, says Plato. So it takes us back to a bigger discussion, and that's what I want to do in general when I study this topic. And I don't want to confine it to a period, effectively cultural studies, because that's what Eagleton is doing here. He's moving us in the direction of cultural studies, and it just happens to be English cultural studies. And it happens to be in the context of English society. And Eagleton, as a Marxist, like so many British academics of the 70s and 80s were, frames the discussion as a matter of class warfare. And the rise of English likewise so. Any thoughts on that to this point? If not, I shall go on. But this move towards Longinus seems to me pivotal. Again, when Longinus includes poet Homer alongside of Plato, the critic of Homer, we see that something very different is going on. A philosopher is alongside a poet, and both of them are capable of the sublime. It's a move to break apart, and again, Percy Shelley follows that viewpoint more or less, and I think that's clear for us to see. So what happens next? I mentioned the Poetics. Let me say something about that. I mentioned Aristotle's Poetics, but we also have to say in the Poetics, even though Horace is aware of the Poetics, and the neoclassical or the Hellenistic poets are aware of Aristotle's Poetics, they don't, and they're there in the medieval period. They primarily come in the medieval period through Eastern Christendom, through Islam. And this is interesting because they get lost in the West. They're rediscovered only in an Arabic paraphrase by a philosopher by the name of Averroes. And figures like Horace and the Roman rhetoricians were never quite lost, but they weren't really recovered until the Renaissance. So the Renaissance really is what it purports to be. It is the revival of a view of classical learning. That really is there. But the problem is that in the interim, Poetics had moved in the direction of rhetoric. Rhetoric became the primary consideration in Poetics. From an academic level, not that there is an academy per se, but the study in the monasteries looked at poetry in terms of rhetoric and not in terms of poetics per se. And unfortunately, what came up in the Renaissance and in the neoclassical poetics of the 18th century, the quarrel of the ancients and the moderns, and is the appeal to Aristotle's rules, rather than seeing Aristotle referring to genres and an actual revival of classical poetics. So in a sense, neoclassicism isn't classical enough, is what I'm saying. It sees it as rules rather than as expressions more in the direction of, I think what needs to happen is something like a marrying of Longinus's emphasis on the greatness of spirit with an attention to genre, and with attention to diction, and with attention to meter, and how those are part of beautiful literature and effective literature. So note that Shakespeare, I'm teaching a Shakespeare class concurrent with this. Note in Shakespeare that the aristocracy speaks in rhyming couplets. Blank verse, but often in rhyming couplets, when they want to be authoritative, then they add rhyme to the whole ordering principle, the hierarchy that they're trying to reinforce through that. That's in the Renaissance by Shakespeare. We'll find that writers in the same period will follow that or disagree with it to some degree. So for example, Milton, who I'm also teaching in my intro course, Milton writes his epic, but says, I'm not going to write rhyming couplets because that's the product of a barbaric age. What does he mean by a barbaric age? His own. He says the Homer didn't have to write in rhyming couplets. Virgil didn't have to write in rhyming couplets. Why should I write an epic in rhyming couplets? I'm not going to be constrained by the rules of some sort of new consensus on what classical poetics is and deviate from what classical poetry actually evinces to us, namely that they don't use rhyme. So I'm not going to be shackled by that, and he writes in something freer than that, and yet it's clearly influenced by the notion of the classical period. So his sentences, we would call them, go on for many, many lines in a way that nobody would write now, but have a grandeur about it, and there's a point and a counterpoint within it that fits the period, a periodic style. But that's there. Now, again, when Eagleton comes to speak of the rise of English, he's talking about it now as a branch of study. This is my second point. He's talking about it as a study, but he's not talking about it as an artistic phenomenon. Note that. This is a key point. He is not talking about the writing in English. So he excludes Old English, Middle English, and largely Renaissance literature, so 16th century. He largely ignores the 17th century. In fact, he does. He only picks up the discussion in the writing of the Augustines, which is concurrent with the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment's belief in things like reason and nature, etc. Those sort of ideals, reason, nature, order, propriety, etc. But he ignores the English writing, and any discussion of poetics from an English perspective has to include the English poetry, the English writing, and not merely what the establishment thinks about the study of English. In other words, poetics and criticism have to be considered together, and he cuts them, severs them from one another. He did that at the beginning, and he continues to do that. And the reason why he does that is because he doesn't want to see the discipline of English from a traditional vantage point. I think. That's my hypothesis. He doesn't want to consider the idea that there might be a tradition. And as Eliot rightly remarks, we are the tradition. We are included in the tradition. As another writer says, we're standing on the shoulders of giants. It's an 18th century expression. Homer is one of our contemporaries. We include him when we look at the world. We include that. Eagleton has a progressive mindset which wants to be future oriented. The ideal society for Eagleton is a communist society, and it's at odds with the notion of the past. We want to break with the past. We want to liberate the workers so they can seize the means of production, etc. So he's I would say, ideologically, to use his language, opposed to the idea of the tradition as having any consideration in the discussion. But the classical poetics of Horace assumed the reality of the tradition and worked within it. Likewise, Cicero, when he writes the Offices, he's clearly hearkening to Plato's Republic, the polis. In other words, the authority of the Greeks. And yet, he thinks that he can build upon that and expand on it. Likewise, Virgil, when he writes the Aeneid, he is presupposing the greatness of Homer. So much so that he's using the whole generic apparatus of the epic for his own structure of the epic. So he begins with the invocation of the muse. He goes to a council of the gods. His hero descends to the underworld. It's encyclopedic in scope. It uses a very refined form of diction that is only to be found in the epic. So if we had an ear for the poetics there, we would be aware that he's writing in an epic genre, in other words. It's hard in translation to pick that up. But dactylic hexameter is the epic meter. Homer uses it, and so does Virgil. And so there is such a thing as a tradition, and those in England, this is the third point, and it's connected to the other two, those in England continue to believe that the ancients were the greats in the universities. And hence Lewis and Tolkien still appeal to the template set by the Greeks and the Romans. In their studies, they study the greats. And when they go on to study English literature, they're going to use the same criteria to push English literature. The same criteria. Because they assume its legitimacy, and it's demonstrated its legitimacy over the course of time, and they see themselves in keeping with the great tradition. And now they're a part of it, and English has been included in that greater tree. So English is just a subset there, and they're particularly going to dislike this. English, for all of its claim to be wedded to a particular idea of liberty, demonstrates the infusion of Christianity into the classical genre. And Milton is the greatest illustration of that, We have a classically educated man who thinks that the classical world's worldview is defective and that Christianity perfects it. That's part of the tradition, particularly as it arises in the 17th century. Even in Shakespeare, in the Renaissance and in 17th century literature, there is no doubt that all the writers have an adherence to the Christian faith and think it as superior to the Greeks and the Latin world, even as they read the Greeks and the Latins. Christianity is an addition that perfects. It takes the gold of the Egyptians and uses it properly. It follows the Augustinian template here. Right? Remember he said that at the end of On Christian Doctrine, Book 2. It's like plundering the Egyptians. God calls upon the Israelites to plunder the Egyptians. He tells the Egyptians to give their gold to the nascent nation of Israel, not yet constituted. And with that, they then are to use it as God will direct them, which will be built to inlay the temple. Unfortunately, on the way, they build a golden calf. Augustine doesn't get to that point. That's an important point about how the gold is in and of itself not valuable in a rational or natural sense, which is what the Enlightenment assumes. This is the problem with the Enlightenment. It assumes the universality of reason as a good unto itself without a proper view of human nature, which only comes from God's revelation. Key point. The Enlightenment is an atheistic movement. It loves reason. It loves nature. It assumes the humanizing benefit of pursuing reason and nature in the sense of Longinus, of greatness of spirit, but it doesn't differentiate a Christian development of what constitutes a greatness of spirit, doesn't even identify that, and to some degree it opposes it. So the Romantics, to case in point, oppose Milton's Christianity. They recognize the greatness of his epic, but they oppose the Christian trappings, as they would see, of the epic. And they will see Satan as the hero, more or less, which is a complete misreading. But why do they do so? Because Satan demonstrates greatness of spirit. And furthermore, he seems to demonstrate a political allegiance against monarchy, the monarchy of heaven, which is a tyranny. And then they simply try to reframe Milton's Satan in more complementary terms. So they make him less committed to revenge, which is morally repugnant, and less of a narcissist, which is morally repugnant. They try and sort of airbrush Milton's Satan in their own works. And you find that, I did that last semester when we studied Romantic poetry. But that's what the Romantics are doing. They're demonstrating Longinus' greatness of spirit in the great spirit of Satan, clearly at odds with Milton. So they're trying to, again, universalize greatness of spirit. But what Christianity has done is it has identified what greatness of spirit is and opposed the classical tradition in doing so, but has done so using the flagpole that the classical age has put into the ground, namely the epic. And so now we see greatness of spirit in the humility of the Son of God, who will come to bear the sins of mankind, sins that he did not commit, out of the grace of the Father. That's what Book 3 of Paradise Lost shows us. We lose paradise, he gives paradise, and it's a paradise within happier far. So that, again, escapes the notice of Eagleton. He doesn't even want to talk about religious matters, just like Bloom didn't want to talk about religious matters. Religious, moral, neither of them want to consider this, except in the terms of ideology, except in that way. And Eagleton, unlike Bloom, supports the ideological social enterprise. That doesn't mean that he supports identity politics. it does mean that he supports reading literature as effectively a subset of cultural studies. And in this particular case, the culture that's being studied is England, and it is class-ridden, and its notion of polite letters needs to be reconsidered. Thoughts, comments here on this? Yes?
So if the Romantics had taken Longinus' text as a whole, they could have applied it properly, right? But they were just taking that one element.
I think they're only interested in greatness of spirit.
Because the other four, do they entirely disregard those elements, or did they just?
Well, what was the other two? The other one that was natural. There were three that could be taught, and there were one that were there. There were two that were there by nature. Those two they hold on to. What was the other one?
There's like noble thoughts and
grandeur of spirit.
Yeah, weighty feelings.
Yeah. So the feelings and the thoughts, and note in Wordsworth, the imagination is both feelings and thoughts. It's the amplitude of both. It's effectively, he's derived that from his understanding of Longinus. And again, it breaches genres. And so in his preface to Lyrical Ballads, he derides 18th century poetics and its notions of propriety and even the strictures of the genre. And for that matter, the subject matter of the poetics, I'm not going to portray aristocrats only in my poetry. I'm going to talk about common people, how they also have a greatness of spirit. And he's correct in one sense. If he's thinking of it as a Christian, entirely correct. Is he talking about it as through a Christocentric lens, that Christ is the God-man? We find our human nature fully expressed in him and only expressed in him, and that is then the standard for understanding greatness, and it will allow English poetry to take a different character. I think not. I think he pushes too much in the direction of the Enlightenment, and he appeals to reason and nature, especially nature, and sees the reasoning as the enemy here, unfortunately. And really wants to push down on the passions, and which he says are the essence of poetry. All great poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, he says, not powerful reason. So he sees it as but still the universalizing tendency of the appeal to nature is there. We go back to nature. And irrationalism then arises where it certainly was not intended in the 18th century. We get no irrationalism in the 18th century other than, and this is very interesting, in the Marquis de Sade. The Marquis de Sade, who becomes as much of an Enlightenment figure as any of the others. And I haven't talked about him. But he effectively says, why do we need to see human nature as other people as part of human nature? Why can I not just follow my natural inclinations, my passions, and do what I want, which is to be sadistic? I take pleasure from that. And the Enlightenment would have to appeal to something outside reason and nature to oppose him. They have to appeal to morality, but the Enlightenment has dismissed morality. So Marquis de Sade becomes the bête noire of the Enlightenment, but he expresses the weakness of their worldview. And from the vantage point of Christianity, here's the man of sin, legitimizing his own sinfulness, and his own age cannot do anything with him without appealing to the very things that they say are invalid, namely the tenets of the Christian faith or the idea of objective morality. They're going to go against that. David Hume says that that's part of a value, and there's such a thing as a fact-value distinction, and values are subjective. Only what science looks at is objective and real and true. Morality is not. So then they can't critique the Marquis de Sade. They have to appeal to something they no longer ascribe to. In fact, they see as part of the problem. So he notes here, and his terms are pretty bombastic. But again, if you take and this is almost always the case in debates as well, when you discuss things with an opponent, the person that defines the terms of the debate is going to win the debate. We say, we're talking about this, we're not talking about that. We're going to decide. And you will find in debates, not that you ever see them here anymore, but that is exactly what happens at the outset. So I'm going to define my terms, it's this and not that, and then good philosophers will actually debate those terms because they realize that once those terms are defined, then they're going to go in a certain direction. Okay, well, but we're going to dispute the terms. People who are not philosophically minded get very tired of having to define terms before actually getting to the subject matter. But it's crucial to the outcome. And Eagleton has defined the terms in such a way that will, I think, preclude a good and legitimate outcome. And so he'll say things like this. The historical period in question is one of revolution, Romantics. In America and France, so both major English-speaking countries, bottom of page 16, the old colonialist or feudalist regimes are overthrown by middle-class insurrection. I think that's a highly tendentious view of the American revolution. Highly tendentious. It's a middle-class insurrection? I don't think so. But anyway, while England achieves its point of economic takeoff, arguably on the back of the enormous profits it has reaped from the 18th century slave trade and its imperial control of the seas, to become the world's first industrial capitalist nation. This is just stock Marxist reading. But the visionary hopes and dynamic energies released by these revolutions, energies with which Romantic writing is alive, enter into potentially tragic contradiction with the harsh realities of the new bourgeois regimes. In England, a crassly Philistine utilitarianism, I agree with his description of it, by the way, a crassly Philistine utilitarianism is rapidly becoming the dominant ideology of the industrial middle class. Fetishizing fact, that's actually Hume's thing, reducing human relations to market exchanges, I'm not sure who does that exactly, but that's a utilitarian thing for sure, and dismissing art as unprofitable ornamentation. Yes, that is the result of the neoclassical age and the Romantics. That's correct. And so art dies. Why? Because it's severed from the humanitas. It's not there to humanize. That's what's going on socially. The callous disciplines of early industrial capitalism uproot whole communities, convert human life into wage slavery, enforce an alienating labor process on the newly formed working class, and understand nothing which cannot be transformed into a commodity on the open market. As the working class responds with militant protest to this oppression, and as troubling memories of revolution across the Channel still haunt their rulers, the English state reacts with a brutal political repressiveness which converts England during part of the Romantic period into what is in effect a police state. Strong language. Not altogether inaccurate. Not altogether inaccurate either. But is it because of a commitment to utilitarianism? Well, we find utilitarian philosophy very common and appealing in this age. The Romantics themselves make no such utilitarian appeal. In fact, they're opposed to it. Anyway, in the face of such forces, the privilege accorded by the Romantics to the creative imagination can be seen as considerably more than idle escapism. Yes, in the face of that, the creative imagination is something ennobling. It holds on to humanitas. That's what it does. It expresses humanity in the midst of a reductionism and the idea of reducing human nature just to physical productivity. On the contrary, literature, and now he uses it once again in scare quotes, now appears as one of the few enclaves in which the creative values expunged from the face of English society by industrial capitalism can be celebrated and affirmed. Imaginative creation can be offered as an image of non-alienated labor. The intuitive, transcendental scope of the poetic mind can provide a living criticism of those rationalist or empiricist ideology enslaved to fact. So it's a value, and he keeps using fact here, and fact is the terms of reduction that comes from empiricism. It's the value of humanity in the face of a dehumanizing movement to conquer nature. And it will push nature and its legitimacy against the dehumanizing colonization of the natural. That is there in the Romantic period. There's no doubt about it. And that will be the defense of the Romantics to this very day by pretty much everybody, Christian and non-Christian. They will cease to the Romantics' appeal to nature. However, from a Christian vantage point, appealing to nature as a universal thing and ignoring the fact that nature is not just good but fallen is a huge categorical error. It divinizes nature. I talked about that in my Romantics class last semester. It divinizes nature. It makes, furthermore, what is good in nature to be in nature in a spiritual sense. So it spiritualizes everything. It expresses what I call pantheism or panentheism more particularly. Panentheism. It sees God in everything, and then pantheism becomes the dominant ideology of the Geisteswissenschaften. Hegel is a pantheist. He's a pantheist. And what does pantheism entail? It entails, for all the defense of the human, that there is no distinction between good and evil, really. It's all a matter of perspective. Cancer kills you, that makes cancer evil. We kill the cancer, that's good. So killing is not in itself bad, but it depends on the context. Which is true, of course. That it does depend on the context, but there are general principles which we will attribute to the laws given in the Decalogue, and chiefly the summary of the greatest commandment, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. These are then the considerations that need contextualization. But love is not the push of the Romantic age. It's the imagination. And it's not the poetic mind as opposed to the body. And again, the Romantic period starts to push an idea of human nature, which is largely incorporeal. So the 19th century and into the 20th century, in the Geisteswissenschaften, it will see human nature largely in spiritual terms and in disembodied terms, and push us in the direction of the heresy of the ancient world for the Christians, namely Gnosticism. And Gnosticism, ironically, although it is opposed, although the age says that it's against the aristocracy, always appeals to an aristocracy, but now the aristocracy are a spiritual aristocracy. And who is this spiritual aristocracy? Well, it's the university professors that pursue the humanities with the exclusion of Christian theology. So those are important considerations here. It excludes Christian theology from the university, even though the university is only a university because Christian theology unites all things under Christ. That is the ground of unity. Once the Geisteswissenschaften come in and try and place man at the center of the curriculum rather than God at the center, we find that we don't get universities, we get multiversities. You know that it's the subject of science fiction right now, the multiverse, Doctor Strange and all that sort of stuff. It's there in popular fiction right now. That is a theory that's held in the academy being expressed here. It's the postulate, it's the downstream consequence of pantheism and furthermore of Gnosticism. It's a even though it's called an ideal, a utopia, it's actually incomprehensible, irrational. And certainly it doesn't include all of humanity. And note that those fictions about multiverses always come against the backdrop of a very dystopian world in which forces are destroying life as we know it, and usually coupled with technology. I see those as all those fictional portraits as sort of demonstrating consequences of ideas. So we don't live in this cosmos. We could have multiple possibilities, and maybe they're happening all at once. Or maybe we're living in one while we're actually caught in the matrix of another. Again, the movie The Matrix. We think that we're doing this, but really we're caught up in a web that we're oblivious to. And who will lead us through that? The guru of the Geisteswissenschaften, the university professor. So the university professor is no longer, as Martin Luther thought he would be, somebody who was read in the scriptures and appointed people to the Word of God as the humanizing ground of all goodness, beauty, truth, godliness, justice, but rather a university professor in his spiritual priesthood, promoting a greatness of spirit that he possesses and others possess on a less exalted basis. So again, we just get a new priesthood come in place of the old priesthood. We get rid of the Christian, we come up with the secular humanist. And what was called at first or believed to be a universal characteristic breaks down, and we get identity groups taking the place and say, well, I want the greatness of the spirit of the Aboriginal expressed in the university. So we're going to have Aboriginal studies. We're going to include it in the school curriculum because we don't want to deny the greatness of the spirit of the native, which they seem to conceive at odds with the rest of humanity. So then we end up getting the politics of guilt and pity coming in back and forth, which a writer by the name of R.J. Rushdoony talks about, and I think quite helpfully delineates there. And move over to 19 here. There's a lot I want to say here in relation to this, but let me move over to 19. He talks about symbolism, which again is an important consideration in the Romantic period. What does this symbol mean? It's actually S.T. Coleridge that places a great deal of emphasis on the symbol, but so Eagleton picks this up, discussion of the symbol, page 19. At the center of aesthetic theory at the turn of the 18th century is the semi-mystical doctrine of the symbol. For Romanticism, indeed, the symbol becomes the panacea for all problems. Within it, a whole set of conflicts, which were felt to be insoluble in ordinary life between subject and object, the universal and the particular, the sensuous and the conceptual, material and spiritual, order and spontaneity, could be magically resolved. It is not surprising that such conflicts were sorely felt in this period, because of commodification, at any rate. Whereas the dynamic and spontaneous energies of social progress, a few lines down, were to be fostered but curbed of their potentially anarchic force by a restraining social order, the symbol fused together motion and stillness, turbulent content and organic form, mind and world. Its material body was the medium of an absolute spiritual truth, one perceived by direct intuition rather than by any laborious process of critical analysis. In this sense, the symbol brought such truths to bear on the mind in a way which brooked no question. Either you saw it or you didn't. It was the keystone of an irrationalism, a forestalling of a reasoned critical inquiry, which has been rampant in literary theory ever since. Now, this is Eagleton's summary statement, and I think that he's not that far off the mark. contemporary literary theory is predicated on the truths that the Romantic period bequeaths to us and the problems that arise out of it. And the Geisteswissenschaften are simply the hermeneutic, the way of reading. So one's a poetics and the other is the way of reading that poetics. And both of them are rooted in irrationalism. It was a unitary thing, however, is what he says, and to dissect it, to take it apart, to see how it worked, was almost as blasphemous as seeking to analyze the Holy Trinity. Quote. That's Eagleton's quote. Now, for me, the keystone of irrationalism is Harold Bloom. As much as I think he's amusing, his appeal to the aesthetic is irrational. And that he appreciates it and other people can't. And here's the books that express this. But it's got nothing to do with morality. It just has to do with taste. It's an appeal to his knowledge as the high priest, the Gnostic, which he is very happy to claim for himself. He's a sort of a Gnostic. The Academy birthed Gnosticism at the end of its tether. But the assumption of this is that all of its various parts work spontaneously together for the common good, each in its subordinate place, and it is therefore hardly surprising to find the symbol or the literary artifact as such being regularly offered throughout the 19th and 20th centuries as an ideal model of human society itself. If only the lower orders were to forget their grievances and pull together for the good of all, much tedious turmoil could be avoided. Now, I agree with him on what he's saying here. So why is this relevant here? Well, because last class I talked about a theory of literature that arose out of T.S. Eliot, a school of criticism called the New Critics. And it's in the 1940s. In America, it's in the 1930s. In Britain, F.R. Leavis. In England, in America, Wimsatt and Beardsley and are primarily features, and they will talk about, again, the text as the subject of study, and they will introduce the idea of fallacies outside of that, the intentional fallacy, the affective fallacy, the affective, both fallacies. The intentional appeals to the author's intention, the affective to the audience's, the reader's feelings. These are ways of fallaciously reading the text. Rather, we will read the text as a text and we won't consider social issues at all. Now, that is how Bloom was taught. Outside of the tradition. It wasn't seen in a traditional way. Now, this is a debasement of this because I think the American New Critics would have seen things in the light of a tradition. And it's clear that T.S. Eliot talks about tradition as a living, ongoing thing. We are part of a great tree. We're the blooms on the tree. The tree still, it's not dead yet. It's like the white tree of Gondor. It's mostly dead, and I think Tolkien actually may have some of that in mind here. That the white tree of Gondor, it's dead. There's stewards have been there in the city, but the tree, which symbolizes a continuity with the past, is still dead. But we believe that one day maybe the bloom will come again, and it does. The bloom comes on the tree. The stewards of the dead tradition are still there to preserve the tradition, but they haven't yet brought it to flourish. We don't solve the problem by getting rid of the tree or burning it out of existence. But that is the tradition. Now, the New Critics, divorced from the tradition, will simply see a text as there's an influential essay, the verbal artifact. He refers to that. He doesn't refer to the author, but the idea of a verbal artifact. And we'll see it as an object almost, an object of art in written form. By the way, the book I mentioned to you that we're going to read, At War with the Word, is going to defend the New Critics against the others' competing critical views. I think this is Beardsley. You can look it up. But it's called the verbal artifact, and he refers that here explicitly. So all of its various parts work spontaneously together for the common good, each in its subordinate place, and is therefore hardly surprising to find the symbol or the literary artifact as such being regularly offered as a new form of religion. So it's a form of religion without Christ. It's a humanism without Christ at the center of it. It's an implicit Christianity, but not an explicit Christianity. And the way it works is in accordance with something that we've seen many times from the beginning of a study of literature. It works in terms of the microcosm and the macrocosm, and the presupposed analogy between them. So the microcosm being a little world that will reflect the macrocosm of the whole world. And this will be a worldview then. The macrocosm will contain a worldview, and it will include the whole of what interests the polis. Civics, morality, good conduct, good economics, proper politics. That will be in the macrocosm, and that will be expressed in the verbal artifact, which is the microcosm of that. And so we will choose little verbal artifacts, little poems that will reflect the macrocosm and the bigger worldview issues. That's the study that arose in the 1930s and 1940s as English develops as a discipline. And it holds that, I would say, supremacy all the way through the 1960s, when it suddenly comes under serious attack, among other things, because, as Northrop Frye says, there's an implicit appeal outside of its own regulations to religion. And he's correct. It does. And so they should, my retort then would be, admit what Frye is saying. Say, yes, it's not a matter of disinterested study of a verbal artifact without any prejudices, because that's as if we were neutral, is an impossibility. Let's say we do have certain prejudices. We do think that a Christian worldview is true. And we can argue that if you want, but we're just going to assume it, and therefore we study poetry in the light of a humanizing idea of human nature, which has been demonstrated to be historically effective as well, in continuity with the great tradition. And to some degree it fits, again, the idea of type and antitype. The classical world is the type, Christianity is the antitype. It's the fulfillment of the promise of the classical world. That's how I see it, personally. But again, you have to take a broader worldview, macrocosmic view. Now, Eagleton has a macrocosmic view, but the macrocosmic view is that of Marxism. And Marxism reduces everything to material and thinks that value is a transitive thing and has been used by the bourgeoisie, who have been manipulated by the aristocrats to promote art or the verbal artifact or whatever, or the symbol, so that they can stay in power. Now, I don't deny that people that are called aristocrats will do this, and they're selfish, and they're bad people. That doesn't dispute that there is such a thing as a great tradition. As I think as Martin Luther said one time, I think it's Luther, but it might not be, he said, God can draw a straight line with a crooked stick. The tradition can still be valid even if some of its exponents are vulgar, disgusting human beings. Just like, again, becomes a religious dogma, can a priest who's an immoral man administer the sacraments? If the priest had to be a perfect human being, no priest could ever administer the sacraments because he's a sinner. But it doesn't make the sacraments invalid, right? So that it gets into that issue of the character of the individuals. Well, that doesn't undermine the validity of the worldview being promoted. It just means that the worldview, in this case, the Christian worldview, which admits that we're all sinners, is going to say, well, yes, there are people, no matter how exalted they are, how much highly we regard them, who are going to demonstrate the validity of their worldview by being sinful human beings. Whereas in the Geisteswissenschaften, they want to airbrush all that out, and the Me Too movement, and no, we, the people that best represent the progressive worldview, we're going to ignore the fact that they're predators, and we've turned a blind eye to it because we can't allow for the progressives to include badness, because they're all basically good and promoting a good human nature, which they share and present in their films, etc. Anyway, I think I'm done for today because I've run out of time.